Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack. Oh, we've got something really exciting today, haven't we, Alina?
Of course, always. We always have exciting guests on.
This is true.
So today we have the fab Michael Schuman, who is a historian, journalist and author. He's written for Time magazine and the Wall Street Journal, amongst other publications. He's also written books on Chinese history with his new book, Superpower Interrupted, which will be due to be published in June of this year. So welcome, Michael.
Thanks a lot for inviting me on.
Oh, no, thank you for joining us. Oh, so this is going to be interesting. Michael, you're in Beijing at the moment, aren't you?
I am in Beijing.
And how are things on Corona lockdown? Are you still locked down in Beijing?
We're not in lockdown like we were. Things have loosened up quite a bit, but there's still a remarkable amount of restrictions on movement here. They haven't, other parts of the country are actually, from what I understand, a little looser than Beijing, probably because it's from the capital. So it's still, there's still a lot of hurdles getting around. You still have your temperature checked everywhere. It's still difficult to get in and out of buildings and apartment complexes and things, and even getting actually harder to get into restaurants. Restaurants want health checks and things like that now too. So life is not normal. It's closed.
Speaking of, I've got to ask you this because it's something that's cropping up a lot in the press here, but I think it's something that culturally we don't really have any idea what it actually is. So the wet markets are open again, aren't they?
The wet markets are opening up, and this is a very common part of life in China. It's basically just like a fresh food market. And, there's nothing particularly interesting about them beyond, the fact that a lot of them will have certain types of wildlife that you would not see in regular food markets elsewhere in the world. Of course, that's where there's suspicion that this is where this whole virus came from, that it jumped from wild animals to people in a wet market. Supposedly, the government is going to get more control on this going forward, and actually, they just announced this week that they're recategorizing cats and dogs so that they're no longer going to be considered as a form of food. So we'll see what impact this has going forward. There's in China, what's written on paper in the rule books and what happens actually on the ground in real life sometimes don't quite match exactly right. So we'll see.
That's amazing news, I've got to say, because that makes me really happy, because obviously being a dog owner and Alex being a cat owner.
Yeah, this makes me very happy. But like you say, there's a big gap to bridge between putting legislation on paper and reality. So we'll just have to see how it pans out.
Listen, guys, Michael, you're here to actually talk about China's contribution. We can talk about what's going on in the world right now for hours and hours, what's happening in China. However much I'd love to, I want to hear Michael's next points about the China's contribution to the world. So we have 5 points to discuss with you. Let's jump straight into the first one, which is the great philosophers. So can you tell us a bit more about that?
So in the West, we look back on, to a great degree, the old Greek philosophers as Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, that these people kind of formed the philosophical basis for Western civilization to a great degree. Well, China has its own version of these great philosophers who had a very, very similar impact, not just on China, but actually on the whole region here in East Asia. And interestingly enough, some of them actually lived around the same time as ancient Greece. So you had this going on concurrently in very different parts of the world. The most famous person that most people know, of course, is Confucius, and he was the most influential. His ideas eventually came to influence everything from government policy and governing ideology to relations within families and family rituals and education systems and the role of women and ideas about the individual in society and moral codes and all this stuff. It's to a great extent you still find this influence today and not just in China but around the whole region. Korea, Japan, Vietnam, other parts of Asia have been very highly influenced by these ideas. He's not the only one. There's also the thinkers of Taoism another philosophy that had tremendous influence on religious practice and art and literature and all kinds of things. And so you had this body of thinkers that created this corpus of work that has been built on over the last, 2,500 years, with all kinds of new thinking and new interpretations and reinterpretations into this great body of literature. And that's still happening. That really forms the basis of, to a great degree, of East Asian, Chinese and East Asian civilization.
Okay, your next point, this one was really interesting for me. You selected a year, didn't you, for us, which is the most important year that you didn't know was important.
Right. We all think of years. I mean, you and I could come up with a bunch of years that pop into people's head. You think of, okay, what are the most important years in history? I don't know, 1492 is one. I'm American, so we would say 1776. But one that I think is incredibly important, and I don't think most people would ever put on the list, is 221 BC. So what happened in 221 BC? That's when the king of a state called Qin unified what was then a very disunited China into something like a unified empire, and he created the Chin Dynasty. And the Chin Dynasty was not the first dynasty, and it was actually one of the shortest lived major dynasties, only lasted 15 years. But the reason it's so important is that it was the first time that China became a unified empire. Before that, Chinese political systems had been much more decentralized. People often use the word feudal. It's not quite right, but you had kind of a royal house, and then you had vassals and barons and different types of relationships with the center that was very decentralized. But the king of Qin, who then became the first emperor, and many people know the first emperor because he was a guy who was buried with the terracotta warriors.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So he didn't like this. He thought that this type of decentralized political system led to chaos. So he changed the nature of government into a centralized state where you had local, provincial and local governments that were basically run from the center by a bureaucracy. And he brought in a lot of standardization, things like he standardized the Chinese script, for instance. He standardized weights and measures and coinage and things like that. So he started to put China together. So you can almost make a case that there wasn't a China before that, and then after the Qin, there was something like a China. And what's amazing about it is that, to a great degree, it's still around. I mean, obviously, this China today does not look at all like the China of 221 BC. But the idea that you have a centralized state in this same geographic region that basically has this a linked kind of historical narrative through all that time that we're still dealing with today is pretty remarkable when you think about history. I mean, Rome is a political entity. Obviously, it's been gone for a long time. But to a certain extent, what was done in 221 BC is still sort of around. One of the motivations that I had in writing my new book is kind of, I think that because in the U.S. and Europe, we tend to write about China within our own historical context. That most writing that people read about China is really of a relatively modern period, because that was when the West started having direct links with China. So I think but China, of course, has 3,000 years of actually recorded history where there's actual writing about it, and the history, of course, goes back longer than that. And I feel that a lot of people just don't get this stuff actually, but it's an immensely important narrative that greatly influences the world today. Because if you want to understand China, then you need to go back before the confrontation with the West. and learn about where China has come from and how that shapes the Chinese thinking about the world today. Because for the Chinese, their confrontation with the West, which is about 200 years old, is relatively, new, quote unquote. When you're dealing with a history that's long, that's 200 years doesn't really sound like it doesn't feel like a whole lot. So that's how the Chinese see it. It's just one part of this massive narrative.
I mean, I completely and totally, utterly agree. I think I'm going to have to buy your book and do some more reading into some of the history, because my knowledge starts from the Opium Wars, which was again about 200 years ago. So
yeah, that's where a lot of people start. And that's the image that people have of China as being a relatively, weak empire. But that was. Again, that's 200 years ago. The relations with the West actually before the Opium War were significantly different, where, China really had the upper hand. I mean, the Portuguese were the first to get to China directly, and that was the early 16th century. And basically until the Chinese really maintained the upper hand in dealing with the West. So even for most of the period that the West has had relations with China, from the Chinese perspective, they've actually been the dominant player in that relationship.
Sorry, Michael, you've gone really quiet again.
I wonder why that is. I'm not moving.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the next point. Yeah.
So let's move on to the next point. We've got the creation of East Asia, and I'm actually really excited for you to talk a little bit more about this point. So,
right. So we think of East Asia as a certain part of the world, same way we think of Western Europe or something like that, right? Or the Middle East, that kind of thing. So what makes East Asia? And to a great degree, it's Chinese civilization and the influence of Chinese civilization. Because what happened, going back now, 1,500, 1,800 years, China was always the most advanced civilization in the region. So when people in other societies in Korea and Japan and elsewhere, when they were looking to set up governments and their own institutions, where were they going to look? Well, they looked to China. So you had a tremendous amount of copying that went on, to varying degrees, of course, depending on the place. But you had, these other societies were borrowing things like government institutions, education systems, legal codes. And I think most importantly, they also borrowed Chinese characters. When they started writing in Chinese and Chinese characters. And of course, with characters came Chinese literature, Chinese ideas, Chinese philosophy. So you had the elite in East Asia that were basically reading the same books and the same history and the same ideas. And this created East Asia as something of a distinct, cultural zone. And it's how kind of East Asia became East Asia. It's because of the influence of China, which is still felt today. The Japanese and especially and the Koreans a certain amount still use Chinese characters in their writing. And it's even though they have their own scripts and everything now, but it's so the influence kind of remains. And it's in arts, it's in temple architecture. Why, when you go to temples in Japan and Korea and China, do they look kind of similar? Well, that's because they were borrowing Chinese architectural styles. So to a great degree, when we think of East Asia, what's East Asia? East Asia is something of a Chinese civilizational zone.
That's incredible. Something else that you've credited China with, which is your next point, is the formation of a global economy. Tell us about that, because that's really interesting as well.
We tend to think in the West of this idea of the global economy forming and globalization when the Portuguese found their way to Asia, and you had these links of trade stretching all the way from Western Europe to East Asia, to China and Japan. Of course, that was an immensely important development in world history. But if you go before that, what you'll find is that there were already very, very extensive links of trade that were linking, Western Asia and the Red Sea, the Mediterranean world, and Africa with South Asia and China. And that these had been around for at that point, centuries and centuries and centuries, and becoming stronger and stronger. Of course, one of them we know very famous being the Silk Road, which was the overland route between China and Western Asia, which was already around 2,000 years ago. And then there were also the maritime routes, which actually became more important because you could ship a lot more by boat than you could by camel. So the maritime routes became more and more and more advanced as shipbuilding became more and more advanced. And so you had very well established shipping networks going from the southern coast of China through Southeast Asia to India, into the Persian Gulf, into the Red Sea. And these existed long before the Portuguese ever found their way into the Indian Ocean. And China, because it was always such a gargantuan economy, was kind of the beating heart of this system, or at least one of the major beating hearts of the system. We think today, we call China an emerging market, an emerging economy. That's because we put China in the context of the last 200 years when China was relatively weak. They had fallen into poverty and fallen behind. But historically, that's not true about China. China historically has always been one of the world's dominant economies, was a major, major center of production and a major consumer because they were so wealthy. So, and China sits at one of the ends of both of these routes. So you had the Silk Road ending in the east in China, and you had these maritime routes ending in the east in China. So it played something of a hinge point between the different trading systems. And China, because it again, we think of China as emerging manufacturing power, but China historically has been a major, major manufacturing power, a major source of production, in many cases of very, very high-tech goods. And you could also say something like China was very influential in creating what we would call a global consumer culture, with products like silk, but probably even more famously, porcelain, which is a Chinese invention. And now we have must-have kind of iconic consumer items like an iPhone. Well, you can think of porcelain as kind of the iPhone of older days, where everybody wanted to have Chinese porcelain on their table. All the rich and famous of the world in the Middle East and in Europe. So you had a global trade of this type of product. So going back several centuries before the Portuguese came to Asia and actually started trading in this stuff. So it's when you put the formation of the global economy in this bigger perspective, and you go earlier than kind of the big Western breakthroughs, the picture starts to look different, and you end up with more of a China-centric global economy, which then kind of implies that what you see happening today is something of a return to what had always been, where you have the reestablishment of these old trading links that had always been a part of the world economy that ended in China, and now you see this kind of re-emerging today.
Your fifth point, we're now going to move further forward into time, and we're going to talk more about the opening of China and what was the most important event since the end of the Second World War. Can you tell us a bit more?
Well, we could sit here and debate what's the most important event, right, since the end of the Second World War. A lot of people would say the fall of the Soviet Union or the fall of the Berlin Wall. You can look at the changing technology, the invention of, let's say, the personal computer would be one. But in that mix, you have to consider the opening of China in the 1980s, with the economic reforms led by the paramount leader at the time, Deng Xiaoping, and the impact that that has had on the world since then. It's because of the opening of China that you see, to a great degree, the world taking shape as it is, where products are made and where they're moving to and from, who has what kind of jobs, what kind of technology we're using, where the world's most important consumers are, which means where's investment, where's business going. And now increasingly, as China becomes a wealthier and wealthier country, the Chinese want a bigger and bigger say in global affairs. So now you're having this economic effect spill over into just about everything else, into diplomacy, into culture. The Chinese are trying to reassert their role in the world that they had in the past as a major superpower, and you know, this what China's role in the world is going to shape much of our world for the next, who knows, 50 years, 100 years. And this all dates back to these reforms that started, you know, in the early 1980s in China. So when we look at where the world is going, you have to look at the changes in China that took place 40 years ago, and the impact that they're having now, the impact that they're probably going to continue to have going forward.
It really is such a good point and so well made. We've been talking about broad strokes, but who's your favorite character in Chinese history, an individual that stands out?
I will admit to being something of a Confucius fan. The reason, which is going to be controversial, because now a lot of people see Confucius as like this fuddy-duddy, you know, arch conservative, who has had a very negative impact on certain aspects of Asian society, like the second-class status of women, for instance. He's blamed for being a supporter of authoritarian regimes and things like that. But if you go back and you read the older classical writing in Confucianism, mainly, of course, the Analects, which is the most famous Confucian text and one of the most famous philosophical books ever written. Which he did not write, by the way, though it's often attributed to him, but it was almost certainly compiled after his death. You see a very different Confucius who, in the context of his own time, was actually quite radical. And the Confucian idea is that people should be judged based on their morality and their virtue, not based on their wealth or their birthright, but on basically their merit, and that merit being based on their virtuous behavior. And when you think about it at that age, it was a rather radical concept, when it was, you know, what family you were born to meant everything, and what connections that you had, that kind of thing, where he was like, no, that's not the way to judge people. So he was an early proponent of meritocracy, and he believed that virtue had almost an infectious effect, that if you're a ruler and you were a benevolent, kind ruler, that people would follow you willingly, that you wouldn't actually need things like laws, and you wouldn't have to coerce people to do things, because you're such a good person that naturally everybody would be drawn to you and to your ideas. So this was kind of, you know, crazy stuff 2,500 years ago. And unfortunately, a lot of it has been lost in a lot of later manipulations of Confucian thought. But when he has an amazingly positive view of humanity in the world, which I think, unfortunately, is often sorely lacking.
He's definitely a worthy candidate. One thing we haven't done, because we wanted to talk thematically, using those broad strokes, we haven't talked about literal things, but let's just quickly mention Chinese inventions that have changed history: paper, gunpowder. Just give us a rundown quickly.
Yeah, we tend to think of China today as kind of like a producer of kind of low-grade products that you find, you know, in your Walmart, and they're really cheap and they're not necessarily great quality. But that's historically, that's not China. China was actually a very high-tech goods producer and was a major source of global innovation. And a lot of products and things that have greatly shaped the world originated in China, including paper and gunpowder, as you mentioned. Interestingly enough, historians think that Chinese discovered gunpowder when actually trying to find kind of some kind of potion to bring immortality or at least youth. That was actually may have been the original intention, and they started mixing around different things. And there's a very funny passage in an old text that warns scientists against mixing things like honey and saltpeter and different things because you could suddenly have an explosion. So it looks like they may have stumbled into it by accident. But as I also mentioned, they also produced things. They also invented soap. They invented porcelain, and which had a major effect on global trade. And in their own context, they also invented movable type printing and other forms of printing much earlier than Europe, which had a very big impact on literacy in China and the region. So when you look back at the history of China, it really is kind of a story of a pretty amazing innovation.
Can we also wonder, today's coronavirus pandemic, which, started in China, will also change the world?
That's interesting. I mean, that's obviously a huge amount of conversation going on about that right now. And I think it will in many ways. I mean, I think it's from a purely economic standpoint, for example, I think it exposed some of the vulnerabilities that countries have by relying on production so far away of certain things that ended up being critical, like pharmaceuticals. That could have an effect of kind of rejiggering where certain types of products are made and why, which then of course could shift things like, where jobs are and where investment is being directed. And I'm also kind of concerned on a bigger level that it's going to intensify a trend that we've already seen, which is this growing antagonism between China and the West, and China and the U.S. specifically. There's a lot of acrimony right now between Washington and Beijing as they kind of trade accusations over the pandemic, and I think the Chinese response has been very unfortunate, very angry, a search for scapegoats to kind of deflect blame from China's role in this pandemic. And we've already seen the souring of relations between the world's two most powerful countries now going for several years, and I feel that this may accelerate it. And I don't really know where we go from here. I mean, it's not positive for the world to have the two most powerful countries and becoming increasingly antagonistic. So that worries me about where this is going as well.
It's a really interesting and, as you say, worrying thing to think about. I'm not going to say who I think needs to keep their trap shut in order to make relations better between China and America. But lastly, let's stay away from current politics. Lastly, if you'd like to be different, tell us one way in which China could have changed the world and blew it. Yeah.
Well, what a lot of people don't know is that China had been incredibly advanced in shipbuilding and maritime technology. And in the early 15th century, the new Ming Dynasty decided it wanted to kind of assert its power and influence across Asia and across the Indian Ocean. And they sent out these fleets, they called them treasure fleets, that were led by an admiral named Zheng He. And these were massive, massive fleets. I mean, in some cases, they were probably more than 200 ships. And the treasure ships themselves were, many people believe, the largest wooden seafaring vessels ever built. And these voyages also stretch tremendous distance, all the way from the South China coast all the way to East Africa. And it's interesting to think about what would have happened if, when the Portuguese rounded the Cape of Africa and ended up in the Indian Ocean, if these fleets were still sailing. The Ming Dynasty, for different reasons, after about 30 years, stopped sending these fleets out, and honestly, the Chinese almost completely forgot about them. And so what would have happened if 50 years later these fleets were still sailing when the Portuguese found their way in? How would world history have changed? Would the West have been able to dominate Asian European trade in the way that they did? Would they have been able to enforce their political will on Asia in the way that the Western powers did, if you still had China asserting itself on the waters in the way that they were in the early 15th century? I mean, they missed each other by about 60 years.
That's nothing in the scheme of things, is it?
And which is nothing in the scheme of things, yes. And, the Chinese definitely had the resources and the wherewithal to continue to do this. But it's interesting, China's political ideology was much more about people coming to them. They wanted people coming to China and giving tribute and acknowledging Chinese superiority. They didn't really often feel the need to go out and seek. So after this kind of brief period, which is really an aberration, in which the Chinese felt the need to actively go around the region and show off their power, after that period, they kind of retreated back into their kind of normal way of thinking about the world. And so by the time Vasco da Gama ended up in the Indian Ocean in India, these voyages were a distant memory.
I love doing historical what ifs, and I've never heard that one before. So I'm really, really mind blowing to think that it could have all been so different. You are writing a book at the moment, and people are going to be really, I know people will be excited to hear more from you. So what is the book about?
The book is called Superpower Interrupted, the Chinese History of the World. And the idea is to tell kind of a world history through China's perspective, and seeing how world events through the prism of China. And from there, to better understand how the Chinese see the world today and what the Chinese think their role in the world should be today. And so it's sort of a history of China's relations with the outside world and perception of the outside world. And from that, I mean, it's a lot of what, one of the big questions that I think we have today is, what does China want? Where is China going? As we were talking about earlier, the next 50, 100 years is going to be very much shaped by what happens with China. And the answer to the question has been somewhat elusive, right? For a while, people in Washington and the capitals of Europe thought that China was going to be a partner, that we were going to connect with China economically and culturally, and that was going to make China a partner. Now, in recent years, increasingly, especially in the US, China is being perceived as a geopolitical competitor and not a partner. So this idea of, well, what does China want, has kind of been somewhat elusive. And a simple, and admittedly overly simple, but one simple way of answering the question is that China wants what it always had. And China's perception of itself, going back, 2,500 years plus, okay? The Chinese always wrote about themselves as a superior civilization. That Chinese civilization was civilization. It defined civilization. And by definition, everybody else was, of course, not civilized. So from a very early period, the Chinese expected other peoples to acknowledge the superiority of China. And this has basically shaped Chinese relations with the outside world for almost its entire history, where China saw the world as a hierarchy, that relationships were not equal, and that China was supposed to have its place at the top of this pyramid, which it considered to be its rightful place. And it always dealt with other countries on that basis. In the real world, it didn't always exactly work that way. Things were more equal, and other societies were able to push back. It wasn't, in the real world of kind of power politics, it didn't necessarily work always that way. But from an ideological standpoint, that's how the Chinese kind of saw the world. And that was often backed by real power. For long periods of time, China was always the most dominant society in East Asia, politically and economically, definitely from a civilizational standpoint, sometimes from a military standpoint. So when you look at that history going back that long, and you ask, okay, well, where is China going? To a great degree, I think that they kind of want to get back what they always feel that they had, which is their rightful place at the top of global civilization. And when President Xi Jinping today talks about the Chinese dream, achieving the Chinese dream, it's a very vague concept when he talks about it. But you can almost see it as exactly that, a restoration of the role that China always feels that it had, and the role that China feels that it deserves in the world.
Look, you had given us so much to think about with this overview of Chinese history, and I cannot wait for this book to come out, because I just think it's fascinating to actually just to have more of a global view than just the westernized one that we usually have of history. Thank you so much for joining us today, Michael.
No, thanks so much for having me on. Really, really interesting. And I appreciate it tremendously.
And when is the book going to be out? Do you know yet?
The book is out June 9th.
June the 9th this year, so it is done.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so as of June.
Well, no, it's going to print. Books, as I know you've written books. Books are never really done.
Yeah.
They just have to eventually go to press.
Excellent. Okay, so this summer you will be able to get a hold of Michael's book, and no doubt Michael will pick it up and see about 50 things he will want to change as soon as he sees the finished copy, because that's just the way us authors roll. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot. Michael.
Join us tomorrow when, God help us, we are launching a little bit of initiative aimed at oral history here at History Hack. And we're going to kick it off with an interview with Peter Hart. It's a mashup with Peter Hart's military history podcast. Gary Bain will be joining us as well. And we're going to be talking about how you can use oral history, the pitfalls, what you should be careful of, and what it can bring to your research. It's a really good, I think, in amongst the madness, a really good lesson on historical sources and how to use them. So really useful for budding historians. We will also have a pole position, which this week it's Alina's turn. So she will be talking about the first mass transport to Auschwitz in 1940. And then down the pub this week, we thought we'd go and a little bit sporty, and we're doing historical fantasy football. We've got a pile of experts and guests and a BBC commentator as well. And we're going to debate basically putting together the greatest football team of all time while we have a few drinks and basically act like idiots. So join us for that too. Until then, stay safe. If you possibly can, stay at home. And this is Nighthawk signing off.